Thanks for joining us today for our discussion around open source risk. We'll pause for a moment to let people get connected, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Just being here, we're just giving a moment for people to come online. All right, it looks like we got a pretty good crowd this morning. So thank you everybody for taking time out of your day to join us for our webinar. Let's go ahead and get started. Uh, My name is David Green. I work on the sales and marketing team here at AppSec. I'm joined today by Bob Boule, our head of product, and we're going to talk for the next 30 minutes or so about managing open source security risk and how we can really make open source give the full power of open source while still preserving the security that we need within the organization. Um, our our theme of the webinar is really looking at the evolving threat landscape in open source software, techniques that you can use for assessing open source security risks, and what is the security posture of your open source components, and then strategies for how application development teams and security teams can work together to minimize those risks. And the whole goal here is to continue to get software out the door as fast and as securely as possible. And so as we go through all the discussion today, it's all going to be with that kind of practical objective in mind of getting software out the door and shipped. Um, for those of you who may not be familiar with AppSec and are joining us today, AppSec is in the business of providing comprehensive application security across all of your software components, both first-party code that you may write, third-party code that you may buy, and open source components that you may integrate into the work that you do. And our focus is in how do we simplify and accelerate application security from really the place where the developers committing code to the actual deployment. And we're going to do that using a combination of automation capabilities driven by AI, open source security tools that we ourselves make use of. We're big believers in open source and the power of open source, all tied back to the software delivery process. Today we're going to really be focusing more generally on the themes around open source security, but we will, at the end of the day, give you an example of how that open source security can be implemented using the capabilities that we offer in AppSec's Delivery Shell product. And to that, we do have an offer for everyone who's joining today, which is if you're interested in what you've seen today and you'd like to actually go experiment with evaluating open source risk within your own environment using the AppSec tool, we do have a free evaluation environment that we'll provide you access to that gives you or your developers the ability to basically instantly check on demand the security posture of any open source component that you may be using within your environment, get a full report of that, of a kind of security posture, software composition analysis, software bill of materials, whatever you may need to have a full understanding of the security picture of that open source component. And that again is available to all of you who attended today, and we'll follow up with you on that after the program. Okay. Now, for our session today, we're going to be kind of talking about the security implications around using open source. And just to set the context, open source software really is it's been revolutionary for software development, but also is a double-edged sword, right? It brings incredible speed to market and cost savings to the application development process. There's a tremendous amount of innovation happening within the community. Communities are dynamic, growing. There's always new ideas coming out. And by using open source components into your software, you get the benefit of all that. Statistics are, I've seen statistics as high as 90% of software being written today originates in open source, right? At the same time, though, there are some core challenges, right? Which is, open source is literally everywhere. So it's hard to keep tabs on what you're using, what you're not. From a process standpoint, typically it's developers who are making the decision as to which open source components to use, and they typically do it at the time when they're building their code. The security teams typically don't get visibility to those decisions until much later in the SDLC, when it's much more disruptive to try and make a change. And so part of the challenge we're trying to do here is, given open source is everywhere, and given the developers and AppSec teams are kind of operating on different time horizons, how do we start to converge that so that we don't end up with hidden costs that comes from open source security risks that are just overlooked or not visible until it's much too late in the process? And so that's really going to drive the agenda for our session today. We'll start by just walking through kind of a taxonomy for how we think about open source risk at OpsumX. There's kind of three pillars to that: operational risk, security risk, legal risk, and kind of some suggestions about how you might measure and quantify each of those risks and some of the data points you may want to gather from your environment to understand that. And so that's then going to give us a body of information around the security posture of open source components that then we need to operationalize as part of our ongoing development and SDLC process. And so that's when we'll get into that. How do we start to build a more proactive, holistic management program that incorporates this idea of continuous monitoring and continuous review? We'll take a few minutes just to give you a demonstration of how this all might appear within a product using OpsumX, and then wrap up our session from there. Okay. So with that as introduction, Bob, happy to have you here for our webinar today. And let's talk a little bit about how somebody could measure and understand the security risks of their open source components.
Awesome. Excellent. Thanks, David. No, I'm happy to be here. And I think, guys, this is a really, really important topic. It's one that's near and dear to my heart, mainly because I think that open source, it provides such a large amount of leverage to companies, right? And to developers who don't have to go out and write functions and other pieces of code that are available in the open source community, that are available out there to be brought in. And I think the other piece of this is because of the ubiquitous nature of open source, risk management just becomes a fact of life, right? And so when we start thinking about how we measure open source risk, there are three main pillars. One is operational risk. This is really about how healthy is the project that I'm using? How vibrant is it? How are there a lot of people using it? Are there a lot of people contributing to it? This is super important because the risk that's associated with the operational part of this is associated to, if it's an abandoned project and you're using it and it's deep in your code, and you're using it in a lot of different places, it goes from being open source to you having to maintain it yourself, if that's the case. And so that piece of this is really important to get visibility into. Then there's security risk. This is probably one of the most obvious ones, right? I mean, this is the one that everyone thinks about, right? Both from a tactical and from a strategic perspective, right? So tactical is, how many vulnerabilities does this thing have in it in its current release? The strategic is, sort of what is the mean time to repair? How many CVEs has this thing seen? How prone to security issues is this? Remember, most of us go into using an open source project not knowing a lot about the people that are writing the code behind the scenes or contributing behind the scenes. And so, something that is more susceptible to security issues, or, where there is a mean time to repair that gets stretched out, create some risk. And then obviously there's the stuff that we all know about, right? The legal risk. Like, what are my obligations when I use this? Do I have restrictions around copyleft licenses? And, what are my obligations based on a copyright notice? And what disclosures do I have to make? So this is all things that you need to look at. And then obviously, the way I'm using the software, how does that get factor into it? So is this a SaaS offering? Am I shipping the software? If it's a multi-license, which one applies to me, right? So again, understanding those things. This, to my mind, there's a lot of subcategories here, but this is how we've categorized, sort of the top level, on that open source risk piece. David, you can go to the next slide.
Yeah,
Yeah.
hey, Bob, as I
Yeah,
do that, just one note for folks here. If you do have any questions as we're going through the session today, please use the Q&A function here within the webinar, and we're happy to take those questions as we go. We'll just roll those right into the conversation as Bob's kind of going through the content today. So,
awesome.
Bob, go ahead.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. So let's take a look at that first pillar, right? The project operational risk. So it's really about measuring operational health as a leading indicator to the project's long-term viability, right? So an inactive project isn't going to receive updates, isn't going to get security patches, or you may have to take that on yourself, which obviously changes the dynamics of open source, right? So if there's not a vibrant community around it, I'm not suggesting that you'd never use it, but you have to be willing to accept that risk, right? and be prepared to do those things on your own. And again, I think when we look at project activity over time, community and contributor health over time, these are the things that help us measure how risky this is or how active this community is. And of course, there's always outliers, right? So you get well-known projects that have lots of stars and forks, but may have fewer contributors or fewer contributions just because the project's so stable, all the way down to a new project where you start to see a spike in people using it, so that you see a spike in people contributing to it. But over time, as we're going to talk about later, those dynamics might change, right? And so again, we want to make sure I think, guys, the risk here is really made up of, am I going to get stuck with a project that I have to maintain myself? Right. I think that's the risk here, because that's counterintuitive to the leverage points that are available to you in open source. So that's really sort of the operational risk. I think there's a build here, David, as well, right? Yeah, there we
Yeah, I
go.
mean, Bobby, I think that's some of
Yeah,
the metrics you might
yep,
use. Yep.
yep. So the sample operational risk metrics are going to be, again, project stars, forks, watchers, contributors, number of contributions, the average release cycle, right? Date of the last update. Those types of scenarios are really sort of leading indicators to that project health. And again, in order for it to be healthy, you don't need a million people watching it, but you do need,
Right.
a combination of these types of stats that lead you to believe that there's a healthy community around this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I think in one of your comments, Bob, I think to the beginning, right, is that the developers when they pick the software are usually just picking because it feels like it meets the need that they've got right now in front of them for the code that they're building right now, right?
That's right. Yep.
And without visibility of these sorts of considerations, they don't have any way of thinking about this.
Well, that's it. And guess what? If I find something that fits the bill and I don't consider this, I stop looking, right? Like,
Yeah,
oh, I found
yeah,
something, right? And so making good choices and making solid choices at the tactical level are super important. And we want to make sure that, our philosophy is we want to make sure we provide the data in order for those choices to be made properly.
yeah, 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 yeah. That's great.
Excellent.
Good. All right. Well, great. Well, let's talk about security because I think this is where people usually start, right? I mean, interesting that you started with
Yes.
operational instead of
Yes.
security. I think that was a conscious
Yeah.
decision, right? But security is, I think, what people usually think about for open source.
Yeah, and I think here, we need to think about security in two ways. One is the tactical, like, what is the security posture of this thing right now? But I think looking at what the security posture is over time will give you a sense for the level of, again, engagement and the level of seriousness taken around security issues, right? Again, I don't know anything about the people that are writing this code. I don't know how security conscious they are, but what I can tell from the outside is the project has, over the last 12 months, 1,000 CVEs or none, right? And so I can look at that and say, wow, okay, we're leaving a lot of gaps in terms of security in the code that's being written. The other thing we can look at is, sort of how quickly these things get remediated, right? So if there's a CVE that's been disclosed that's associated with this project, based on a CPE that's listed by MITRE, then how quickly does the community respond to that, right? Because obviously, that puts you in a bit of a precarious position, because either you can fix it yourself or the community can fix it, right? And so either way, you need to get a fix to that, and then ultimately, or for you, starting to sort of implement things like compensating controls. Again, this all goes back to that risk level. And then I think the other piece of this, when we start thinking about it from a supply chain perspective, right? How effectively is the source code repo being managed? Most of what you're going to see with open source is all public repos. Are they following best practices to secure the code? Do they have code review policies? Do they have pin dependencies? Are there things that that are being done to ensure the security of the code as it lives in that public repo? So again, I think these are all things that are up for consideration, mainly because, again, if you're going to use something, especially if you're going to embed an open source library, it can be hard later to unwind that, right? And so you want to make sure that you're making that conscious choice around these things. And I think we've got some other metrics here, David. If you want to pop those up, that'd be great, in terms
Yeah,
of
yeah.
measuring security risk. Yeah, so there we go. So count and priority of the current CVEs, the mean time to repair, the trends over the course of the last 12 months, that OpenSSF scorecard, things like typo squatting risk, right? I mean, listen, there's a handful of ways to help detect potential typo squatting, and so you want to make sure that you do that. You've got a process in place that's looking at that. The geography of the contributors. This is a little controversial, but I think it makes sense because it's available. Things like project ownership. I mean, I think a lot of people look at things like open source projects, and then it starts off being owned or being driven by an individual or an open source type of organization, and then is taken over by something else, a commercial entity or something along those lines. Um, then priorities change, right? And so you have to be able to evaluate that as the overall project risk calculation here. And so I think making sure you're aware when those things happen is always important. So I think these are another great set of metrics to use to measure that security risk.
Yeah. Hey, Bob, we had a question. Sorry, Ashish asked it just as we were moving off from the last point, but I think it applies here as well, which is, you know, how do how do you how do we give developers visibility to this, right? So
Mhm.
where should developer go to get this information if they're trying to make a better decision when they're choosing open source?
Well, my thinking is, you can go and look, most of this information is public, but nobody wants to spend the time it takes to go find it. It's a bit of an Easter egg hunt, right? Like
Hmm.
to go find all this information and hunt it down and understand it and study the repos. My suggestion is you're better off going to an information aggregator like OpsumX, right? Where one of the things that we'll allow for is in our public sandbox is for you to come out and say, point me at this GitHub repo, and then I'll tell you what this information looks like, right? I'll give you that level of open source risk. So finding a solid aggregator of this information is really something that I would recommend, because nobody has time to go out and just, if you think about how much open source you're bringing in and you multiply that by the number of metrics that you want to look at, right?
Right, right,
It can
right,
become very, very onerous, right? So looking for data aggregators like OpsumX to who you can just point at a repo and get the information that you need and then move on, right? I think
right.
that's my best advice to folks.
Yeah. Well, I think the key here to our first thing, right? The key here is how do we be security conscious without slowing down the release process?
That's right. That's right.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And,
Yeah.
and by the way, doing this level of research on each and every open source project that you want to use will certainly slow you down, right? It's not practical, right?
Right. Right.
The good
Right.
news is that, if you look hard enough, you can find some of this data. The bad news is that who has time for that, right? And so, finding a common source where you can bring all this stuff together. And by the way, I'll give you an example, where, the open source community has stepped up and some of the open source organizations have come together. The OpenSSF scorecard, right? I mean, has become
Mm.
a standard by which we measure the security of a repository, right? And they're looking at the details. They're looking at, sort of how are commits brought in, how are artifacts stored, what are what's the dependency model look like? So all that stuff is critical, and it's just they're an example of an aggregator, and then we'll go ahead and aggregate their information into sort of what we collect to give you sort of a higher level risk assessment. And I think that's really where it's important, is to find that aggregation.
That's great. That's great. That's great. All right. Well, good.
Great.
Well, then let's look at your third pillar.
Yeah, so legal risk. This is always a favorite. One of the things I like to share with people when I talk about this is, we all think about the licenses that are associated with the majority of the projects that are out there, and there's probably, 200 or 300 that are actually active and being used on a regular basis. But there are over 6,000 open source licenses.
Wow.
Things like buy me a beer license is a real thing. You can do the research, right? Where it's a little less, it's a little cheeky, but where the developer says, if you see me in a bar, you got to buy me a beer if you're using my software, right? But I mean, in all honesty, I think this really gets down to looking at risk, right? In terms of copy left type of risk and obligations. What are the obligations that go along with a license, from the permissive, MIT, sort of Apache 2 to the the LGPL, and some of the other Mozilla type licenses that have some weakish copy left, and then obviously the really strong copy left, AGPL, GPL, where you have really strict obligations there. And I think, we've all seen this in the past where, it's not just about being a good corporate citizen. I think it's about, for a lot of software producers, the risk that is there with patent trolls and other folks that will come along and say, "Oh, you didn't follow this, and so now I'm going to sue you," or "You can't
Mhm,
ship this
mhm.
code with your software," right? So these are all things that matter. And obviously, we want to, from a being a good citizen, we want to make sure we follow the rules. But understanding sort of where some of these licenses come in and where they represent risk. It doesn't mean that, oh, I can't use an AGPL licensed piece of code. But boy,
Right,
I don't want to
right,
find out about that after I've integrated it everywhere, right?
right.
Because now I might have a set of onerous obligations.
And just for completeness, when you say strong copy left,
Hmm.
what does that mean?
So the copy left is about what you do if you make changes to the code. So if you take an open source project and you make changes to that code, a copy left license means you have to contribute any changes that you've made back to the open source community. Full stop. You can't alter it in any way without contributing those changes back. Now, altering it may be proprietary. It may be part of your proprietary software. You wouldn't want to make that public, right? But if you
Right,
don't do
right,
that, you're technically in violation, thus opening yourself up to legal risk, right?
right.
For the patent holder or the copyright holder of that technology. And so that's just one of those things where I think a lot of people will tend to shy away from strong copy left because they don't want to put, unless, now again, there's shades of gray here. If you have no plans to make any changes to it, great, right? Follow the obligations, if there's disclosure obligations or whatever, great, right? But so many people get stuck or, sort of really sort of wrapped around the axle on, what's going to happen. Like as an example, any of our younger software companies out there, these are the types of things that come up during investment due diligence
Yes,
or
yes, 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 yeah.
acquisition due diligence, right? Where, they'll contract and say, "Oh, you've got AGPL code in here. Are you aware?" And of course, if you're aware and you're prepared to make the case, not a problem. If you're not, you've got some explaining to do, right? So
Right.
so that this is really sort of where those risks come
Yeah,
from.
yeah,
And again,
that's
I
helpful.
think,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm sorry, David, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
Good, 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 good.
No, no. So again, I think the risks that we want to look at here are the current license. And by the way, licenses do change. See SEMGREP, it changes. So current license obligations, like what obligations do you have? Is there a notices file that you have to generate? A lot of those things are fairly benign, but you're expected to follow them, right? Changes in license from a prior release. Again, another piece of this. This happens. Likelihood of litigation. Again, I think you have to assess that based on the project, your use of the project, and sort of what you plan to do with it. But again, I think it all starts with awareness in terms of how these things are licensed. And for me personally, if I'm staring at an AGPL project versus an MIT project and they both do the same thing, I'm going to take it off the table and use the MIT license project, right? Because then I don't have to think about it anymore, right? The terms are
Right,
much less
right,
onerous, right? So
right.
again, I think these are things that, again, we're not suggesting that you can't use those pieces of software. It's just awareness and knowing your obligations are the important part to avoid any legal issues.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. That's great. Well, so Bob, so I think you've given a complete picture here, right, of the metrics and the considerations. Now the question becomes how do we operationalize that and put in place a framework and a set of processes for managing open source risk on an ongoing basis. And so, at this point in the session, let's shift our attention there. Again,
Sure.
folks, if you've got other questions that we haven't covered, I know there's a few questions that came in that we actually, Bob, you covered in your comments, but if there's any other
Mhm.
ones, folks, that come up, just keep putting those into the chat and we'll answer those as we go. So, why don't you talk about how we manage all this?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So, I think this risk management program, again, we want to go ahead and shift from reactive mode where, oh my God, we found a problem, to proactive mode where we understand the risks, right? Again, it's not to say that we won't accept some of those risks, but we want to make sure we understand the risk. And so, um,
Apologies
Oops.
about my slide, but
Oh,
my slide's
no
bouncing there.
worries.
Sorry.
No worries. It
There we go.
happens. No worries.
Zoom glitch.
Um,
All right.
and so again, I think it starts by establishing clear policies, right? And I think each organization is going to be a little different depending on the software they're building, their target audience, sort of who's working with the software. And again, they'll establish that policy or that set of guidelines that help provide guardrails to their developers around here are the things that you can and cannot do when it comes to bringing in open source projects. Then I think the next challenge is how do I automate it? Because listen, let's face it, I think on the average project, there's literally hundreds of open source libraries that are going to be brought in, if not thousands, right? Depending on the size of the project. Nobody wants to audit that manually. And again, under the heading of let's be proactive, having the ability to say, hey, I want to make sure that I'm checking in an automated fashion the risk associated with all this open source, right? So the ability to say, this has too much license risk, or this has too much security risk, or this is outside of those guidelines that I've established in step one. I need to automate the process of evaluating that with each and every software build to make sure that and by the way, I've my experience tells me that not everybody is going to say, well, we're gonna not deploy this software because this high risk open source project. What they're going to say is, for 30 days from now, we expect you to replace it, right? Like we
Right.
expect you to go down that path, right? And then obviously the ability to block high risk code. So again, depending on the stuff that we're talking about here, right? Like things like there's an existing critical vulnerability, well, that should be blocked, right? Because I don't want, unless I've implemented a compensating control, I don't want to deploy that because I'm opening myself up to very tactical risk, right? And so that needs to be a decision that gets made. So again, having that established policy, having a way to sort of evaluate those policy rules against what's actually happening, and then the ability to, in the event that it rises to the level of too much risk, being able to block high risk deployments. And a lot of times people won't do that all the time, but if the risk builds up to a certain level based on the number of violations, they may holistically decide to block a build and say, hey, we
Right.
need to we
Right.
need to reevaluate this, right? So I think that's really sort of that's our prescription for sort of building this management program. Now, I think, when it comes to security, there's not only just the, hey, this is the parameters that an open source project has to meet. These are the things that we require in terms of licensing and mean time to repair and all that stuff. But there's the tactical part of this as well, right? And the need to be able to say, what is the state of affairs today? Like this, it's great that I've got a properly licensed open source software project that has only had 5 CVEs in the last 12 months, but today it might have one critical CVE, right? So we want to make sure that we're taking those things and evaluating them in real time, to look at the tactical pieces of this as well, and then being able to then prioritize those things. So again, when I look at real world risk, I'm looking at things like exploitability and reachability. These are environmental factors that NVD and MITRE can't assume, right? They can tell you, well, what if it is, or what if it's reachable, what if it's not, or is it reachable over the network, or is the attack vector something else? They can tell you all those things, but what they can't tell you is what it looks like in your current project and how it's currently deployed. And so that's really where bringing in something that's going to help you understand, hey, I found this vulnerability. It's a serious or critical risk vulnerability. However, the attack vector is the network, and I'm not deploying this with network access, so I
Right.
don't
Right.
really need to worry about it, right? Or the code path that's associated with this vulnerability is not reachable by any of the code that surrounds it, right? So again, I think making sure that you have a mechanism there to prioritize is key.
Well, I think that, and Bob, to the first bullet there is zero vulnerability is a myth, and we did a whole session on that a couple months ago, right? That everyone is welcome to.
Yes.
If you want to hear that, go back and check it out. It's on our website. But I do think that when people start looking at open source risk, one of the first things that usually happens is they run the security scan against the open source project, then they get this massive list of CVEs. Then that gets handed to the developers, and they go, "What do we do with this? I don't know what to do with these 150 things."
Yep.
Right. And so I
Yep.
think that's where it becomes so important here is to just stop trying. You're not going to ever get that list to zero to the comment you just made. Just figure out the ones that really matter and just start by fixing those. That's the only practical way to manage this for open source and any software, but particularly important in open source where sometimes those vulnerability lists get very long. So,
Exactly, exactly. And these are opportunities for developers to look at, is there code I can contribute to fix this? Or
right,
is there a compensating control that I can put in place? Or can I reach out to the community? Again, this is where the vibrant community comes into play and figure out what the timing looks like for a fix on something like this.
right.
And again, prioritize it that way. So, yep. Um, Again, I think, operationalizing compliance and audit. This, as we go further up the human stack, right? I think like I said, we're making the open source decisions at the ground level and attempting to put some guardrails in place. However, the problem here is that we want to make sure that there's reporting around this, right? So that people can very quickly, without having to do a full code audit, can understand the open source that's there and see, and they can prove to an auditor that those risk measurements are being followed. I think that's another critical part of this, and automating that, across tens of thousands or hundreds of open source projects is difficult for anybody. And so I think this is where, you can come in and make sure you've got a system that's doing that for you.
And pretty much every one of the compliance works has some kind of requirement now around secure software supply chain, and so open source is going to fall under that.
That's
So,
right. That's exactly
yeah.
right. Yep. Yep. And again, I think the other challenge here is, because open source is so dynamic, it's never a one and done, right? You need continuous monitoring. And so you need a system that's going to come in and say, not only am I going to measure the risk factors that are associated with this library or this set of libraries at the time I've approved it for use, but over time, does it continue to meet my standards? Right. As it changes, as we all know it does, right? Few contributors ebb and flow. Licenses could change. CVEs could, this could be a particularly something that a hacker has decided to focus on as an ability to sort of infiltrate an organization or a set of organizations. So again, monitoring your SBOMs in real time, making sure that you understand the threat vectors around the vulnerabilities, but more importantly, the higher level changes that are being made to the project itself, and then give you those leading indicators that, oh boy, we might need to sign something else, right? Because the more
Right.
time you give yourself to deal with something like this, the better off you are. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to wait until audit time to say, oh shoot, this has changed significantly and we've kept shipping it, right? We want to at least be able to look at an auditor and say, we're making accommodations to ultimately pull this out. This is our game plan, right? Because it's changed so drastically.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. So Bob, so that's great. So I think we walked through kind of the framework for evaluating the risk, and now kind of how to operationalize this. I know you're going to do a little bit of show and tell, but maybe before you do that, let's just kind of do a quick summary of
Mhm.
kind of your key takeaways, then we can jump back into the demo.
Absolutely, yeah. So again, I think the takeaways here are fairly straightforward. It's more than just CVEs, right? It's interconnected. There's a balance of operational, security, and legal factors that you should be looking at. A holistic assessment's necessary, right? So you need to be able to look at all these factors and make the decision. But you have to have the data, right? You have to have a data-driven decision. You can't just, lick your finger, put it in the air, and say, well, let's hope, right? And then again, I think shifting from being reactive to proactive again by staying on top of it, right? By continuously monitoring it. The risk analysis is never a one-time event, right? It's like open source projects change, their dynamics change, their licenses could change, their security profile could change. And again, being plugged into those things so that you can make a decision as you start to see a trend maybe in the wrong direction, that gives you the ability to sort of start making plans
Mhm.
to go down that path. So
Yeah.
And then obviously, some of what I'm going to show you during the demo is, some of the next steps for that we would suggest is inventorying your current open source usage. Perform the initial holistic risk assessment, and then develop a plan to automate and monitor going forward, so that you can provide your developers with guidelines and guardrails, right? And then have a way to visualize a up-to-date risk assessment of every open source project that you're using.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Bob, thank you for that. And just for everybody else on the call today, if what you've heard today are things that you'd like to get a handle on, we're happy to give you the chance to try that out with OpsMX using our AppSec on-demand environment. And you'll see in the demo that Bob's at to show you what that would look like. But we'll send that as a follow-up, and you're welcome to reach out as well. But if this is something you'd like to kind of try for yourself at home, we can help you do that. So. All right, so with that, then, Bob, let me stop sharing and I'll let you walk the folks through an example of what this might look like for them.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll do that. So hopefully you guys can see my screen without an issue.
Yep.
Here's basically we're using our product to sort of show you this right now. What's happening here is that there are two ways for us to start to interrogate the open source you're using. One is as you're going through your CI/CD process, we will pick up on through our scans, both source code scans and artifact scans, and develop SBOMs for each and every one of those projects. But at the same time, we're also extracting all of that open source and providing you with this macro level overview, right? Where we're going to start tracking all of the open source that you're using at the level of your organization, right? So you can ultimately see for each piece of open source that has shown up somewhere in your project sets, we have a risk calculation, number of stars, forks, contributors, number of CVEs, the mean time to repair, how it's licensed. And we're going to show you all that stuff at a macro level so you can start to understand, sort of where the issues might be or what you might need to go and start investigating. Of course, for us, we lean toward risky projects because it makes for a better demo, right? So we want to make sure we show you that. Now that's if you go down that path. The other path you can go down is you can ultimately do, sort of what we call an on-demand scan as well. And I think this just logged me out, but an on-demand scan, this is prior to you bringing it in. Your developer can come in and ultimately say, hey, I've got this GitHub repository that I want to scan. And I want to be able to go ahead and perform that scan. Ultimately by defining some of the coordinates for that thing, and then ultimately scan it. And what it will do is it will create an SBOM for me. It will create all the vulnerabilities of the current release, but more importantly it will add that project to this list of tracked open source projects. And so we can start to track that for you as well. You can create this list on a personal level just as a developer as well. So if you want to keep track of some of these things while keeping it out of the organizations list, because the only time it'll show up in the organizations list is when you start using it. So you can start tracking that for yourself. And again, I think one of the things we're doing is we're offering access to our system. Will let you come in and ultimately do this for a repo that's out there for public use, or if you've got a particular Docker container that you're using where you want to get a breakdown of the open source inside of that, we'll allow you to come in here and tell us what you're doing from or what you're using from a Docker container perspective through Docker Hub or GitLab registry or GitHub registry, and then ultimately go ahead and start scanning those as well. And we'll add them to, again, this holistic list of open source that can be tracked. And again, I think this gets you down that path of better understanding where those risks are. So hopefully that was helpful, guys, in terms of visualizing what it is that we're talking about and sort of how that works. And hopefully that all made sense. Um, I think, guys, that's kind of all we had for today. I want to stop and thank everybody for attending. Hopefully you found this useful. We'll make the recording available to you as well. And then if you have any particular questions, just come out, use the chat bot at our website. Tell it you want to talk to me, and it'll get you over to me, and we'll certainly have a discussion if you want to around sort of open source and open source risk. But again, thank everyone for attending, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month.